There are moments in a franchise's history where the noise stops and something real cuts through, and I think we just had one of those moments in Cleveland. Myles Garrett said something, not in the vague, carefully managed way that professional athletes learn to communicate when they have been media trained within an inch of their natural personality, not through an anonymous source or a filtered third-party account, directly, specifically, with the full weight of exactly who Myles Garrett is behind every word. And the reason I cannot stop thinking about it is not just what he said, but what it means that he chose to say it at all. Let me give you the proper context here, because context is the difference between understanding this moment and simply reacting to it. Myles Garrett is not a player who manufactures controversy for attention. He is not a guy who wakes up in the morning and thinks about what he can say to get his name trending. That is not who he is, and it has never been who he is. What he is the most genuinely terrifying defensive player in professional football right now, a man who has spent years in Cleveland giving everything his body and will could produce on a weekly basis, regardless of what the offense was or was not doing on the other side of the ball. He has watched quarterback after quarterback arrive in that building wrapped in optimism and leave wrapped in disappointment. He has survived every version of the organizational dysfunction that has defined this franchise for most of the last decade. He has shown up for every single Sunday with the same ferocity and the same commitment, even when the people around him were not holding up their end of the deal. That is who is speaking right now. A man who has earned the right to his opinion about this franchise through years of unconditional investment in it. When someone with that profile decides to stop being diplomatic, you do not treat it as background noise. You sit down and you genuinely listen. And what Garrett said is not background noise. It is not a vague expression of frustration that can be massaged into something manageable with a PR statement and a private conversation. It is specific. It is direct. And it is the kind of thing that, once said publicly by a player of his standing, changes the atmosphere of the building in ways that cannot simply be walked back to neutral. He wants Shedeur Sanders named the starting quarterback, not eventually, not after the competition plays out and the coaches weigh their options and the organization finds the right diplomatic language to announce a decision. Now, QB1, the job locked in, the full organizational commitment behind it, entering the 2026 season with clarity instead of the fog that has been hanging over this position for weeks. That is the position Garrett is staking out, and coming from him, it carries a kind of weight that no front office endorsement or coaching staff press conference can replicate. This is the most respected player in that building, putting his name and his credibility directly on Shedeur Sanders, and that is not a minor thing in the calculus of how NFL locker rooms function. But he does not stop there, and this is where the conversation gets genuinely uncomfortable for some people in that organization. Garrett reportedly wants Dillon Gabriel traded, not eased through the rest of the competition, not kept as a developmental option or a veteran safety net, moved, out of the building, gone. And I want to spend a real moment here because I think the instinct for a lot of people is to hear that and immediately soften it, to contextualize it as the harsh edge of competitive frustration and not the sincere strategic assessment it actually represents. Garrett is not being unnecessarily cruel. He is being honest about something that anyone watching that quarterback room with clear eyes already knows. Gabriel has been visibly frustrated. Reports of him feeling disrespected and undervalued in a competition he entered with different expectations have been building for weeks. That frustration does not disappear because everyone agrees to pretend it is not there. It sits in the room. It changes the energy of the room. It creates a tension that has to be actively managed instead of that energy being directed toward building something real. Garrett's position, as I read it, is not that Gabriel deserves to be discarded. It is that the presence of that unresolved tension is a problem Cleveland does not need to carry into what should be a clean organizational moment. Trade him. Give him a fresh start in an environment where he can approach the situation without the accumulated weight of everything that has happened here. Let this building focus entirely on what it is actually building. That is not cruelty. That is organizational clarity, and winning franchises make exactly those kinds of difficult decisions when the moment demands it. Then there is the Deshaun Watson element of this, and honestly, this might be the most intellectually interesting piece of the whole conversation if you are willing to think through it carefully. Garrett is not calling for Watson to be released or pushed out of the organization in any dramatic fashion. His reported thinking is that Watson slides into the backup role behind Shedeur and functions in a supporting capacity. And I want you to really sit with what that means before you react to the surface-level headline of it, because there is genuine football intelligence embedded in this idea. Watson, at this point in his career, and given everything that has happened over the last several years, is not the answer at the starting position. That conversation is largely settled. But what Watson still possesses, and what most backup quarterbacks simply do not have, is the accumulated experience of having operated at an elite level inside NFL offenses during his peak. He has read defenses that most quarterbacks in backup roles have never faced at the highest competitive level. He has processed the chaos of an NFL regular season from inside the pocket, with real consequences attached to every decision. He understands the psychological weight of being the person that offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators are scheming around simultaneously. That knowledge, that accumulated football intelligence, does not disappear because his physical prime has passed. The question Garrett seems to be asking is whether Watson can redirect all of that experience into something that helps Shedeur develop faster than he would without it. Stop treating him as a starter, managing his way back toward relevance. Start using him as the most experienced bridge a young franchise quarterback could possibly have behind him. There is real wisdom in that construction, and it is the kind of wisdom that you only recognize if you are thinking about the quarterback room as an ecosystem rather than a competition. The practical challenge, and I think this deserves honesty, is whether Watson's ego allows him to genuinely inhabit that role, or whether it creates a quiet undercurrent of resentment that eventually becomes its own problem. That is not a criticism of Watson as a person. That is a realistic assessment of what it asks of any human being who has operated at the level Watson operated at, to consciously reframe their own purpose and find genuine meaning in supporting someone else's development. Some players make that transition with grace, and it enriches the entire organization. Others resist it, not always loudly, but in the small ways that become visible over time in film rooms and practice reps, and how they respond in moments of organizational stress. How Watson navigates that psychological territory will be one of the more quietly significant storylines of this entire season. Now, I want to talk about the football logic underneath all of this, because I think the temptation when Garrett's name is attached to a story is to focus entirely on the drama and miss the strategic coherence of what he is actually describing. He is not reacting emotionally. He is reading the organizational evidence in front of him and drawing reasonable conclusions from it. Think about what Cleveland did in the 2026 draft. They invested meaningful capital in offensive linemen. Not one pick, not an afterthought in the middle rounds, but a deliberate prioritization of protection for whoever is going to be taking snaps for this offense. You do not build that kind of infrastructure around a player you are still treating as an option in an ongoing competition. You build it around a player you have already decided is the future, because you are investing in a wall designed to give that player the time and physical safety he needs to develop without getting broken before his ceiling can be reached. Garrett sees those draft picks for exactly what they are: a signal, an organizational commitment expressed through resource allocation rather than press conference language. And his public comments are, in part, his way of saying that the organizational behavior and the organizational communication need to align with each other. You drafted protection for Shedeur. You built around him. Now say it. Name him. Give him the clarity that a young quarterback needs to operate from a position of genuine confidence rather than the particular psychological weight of an ongoing competition where the goalposts might move at any moment. This matters more than people give it credit for when they discuss quarterback development at the professional level. There is a documented relationship between pocket time and quarterback progression that goes beyond the obvious. When a passer has consistent, real time in the pocket, the game begins to reorganize itself at a cognitive level. His processing speeds up because his physical situation is not consuming bandwidth that should be going toward reading the defense. His eyes get cleaner because he is not anticipating pressure before it exists. His decision-making sharpens because the time available to make decisions is actually the time the playbook assumes when those concepts were designed. Throwing a talented young quarterback into a situation where the protection is inadequate and the pressure is constant does not harden him. It distorts his development in ways that take years to unwind. Cleveland just made a significant draft statement about preventing that outcome for Shedeur Sanders, and Myles Garrett is pointing at that statement and asking the organization to finish the sentence it already started writing. The locker room dimension of this is something I keep returning to because I do not think it gets enough serious attention in most of the coverage. When Myles Garrett goes public with something like this, it does not exist in a vacuum isolated from the rest of the roster. Every player in that building knows what Garrett's opinion costs him to share. They know what his credibility is built on, and how many years of sacrifice and consistency sit behind every word he says about this franchise. When a player with that profile puts his full backing behind a young quarterback in front of the entire football world, it reshapes how every other person in that locker room thinks about the situation, sometimes consciously, and sometimes in ways they would not even be able to fully articulate. Players follow the most respected players in the building. They watch who the leaders believe in, and they let that inform their own orientation toward the question. Some of the players in that locker room were probably already leaning toward Shedeur privately. Now the most respected voice in the entire organization has said out loud what they were thinking quietly. And that kind of collective alignment, once it begins to form, becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse without genuine organizational cost. Which brings me to the position the Cleveland front office now finds itself in. And I want to be direct about how uncomfortable that position actually is. You cannot absorb a statement this specific from a player this central to your organization and simply move on without a response. You either respond with action that validates what Garrett said and demonstrates that the organization trusts the judgment of its most important player, or you respond by going a different direction and accepting all of the relational and cultural consequences that come with publicly overruling the player whose presence alone makes Cleveland competitive in games where everything else goes wrong. That second path is not impossible. Front offices override player opinions all the time and sometimes for very good reasons, but Garrett is not any player. He is the cornerstone that opposing teams construct their entire offensive game plan around, the one constant in a franchise that has had very few of them. Damage that relationship and you are not just making a quarterback decision. You are making a statement about the entire culture of the building, about who gets to be trusted and whose investment in this franchise is considered sufficient to earn a genuine hearing when the stakes are real. What I keep coming back to, at the core of all of this, is what this moment reveals about where this franchise actually stands right now. Cleveland is at a genuine crossroads, and I do not use that phrase lightly because it gets deployed so often in sports narratives that it has lost most of its weight. But this one is real. The decision that gets made about the quarterback position in the coming weeks is not just about one season. It is about the next 5 years of what this franchise looks like, what it believes about itself, and whether it has the organizational courage to commit fully to something real rather than managing its way through another year of strategic ambiguity. Myles Garrett looked at that crossroads and decided he was not going to stand silently at the intersection while the organization figured out which direction to turn. He pointed, clearly, specifically, with everything he has earned behind the gesture. Shedeur Sanders has been in that facility working. Reports coming out of that building describe a player who has treated this offseason as a serious professional undertaking, someone rebuilding himself physically and mentally, and doing it with the kind of quiet, consistent urgency that does not need external validation to sustain itself. He is not waiting for the organization to officially anoint him before he treats the opportunity like it is real. He is operating as though the moment is already here and using every available day to be more prepared for it than he was the day before. That is a significant thing about a young quarterback's character, and it is the kind of thing that shows up in the small details of how a player responds to competitive pressure over a sustained period, rather than in a single spectacular moment. The Browns drafted offensive linemen to protect a quarterback's development. Their best defensive player has publicly named which quarterback deserves that protection. The young quarterback himself is putting in the work that validates the investment. The organizational signals are pointing in one direction. The football logic is pointing in one direction. The locker room's most important voice is pointing in one direction. At some point, the organization has to stop managing the optics of an open competition and start being honest about the direction all of this evidence has been pointing toward since the moment Shedeur Sanders arrived in Cleveland. The question is not really about the football decision anymore. The football decision is visible to everyone paying honest attention. The question is whether the people in that front office have the clarity and the conviction to make the call that the evidence demands, to trust their best player, to trust their young quarterback, to trust the draft class they built specifically around his development, and to trust that the momentum quietly building around Shedeur Sanders since day one is real and worth committing to without further delay. Myles Garrett broke his silence because he decided that staying quiet was something he could no longer justify. The organization now has to decide whether it is going to honor what he said with the seriousness it deserves, or whether it is going to manage past it and live with the consequences of that choice. I know which direction the evidence points. I think Garrett knows too. And I suspect when you strip away all the diplomatic language and the organizational positioning and the carefully managed public communication, the people inside that building know it as well.